Blog Talk Radio, the world's largest online radio network.
Live to see it, friends. You're listening to Fast Forward Radio on the Blog Talk Radio Network. Fast Forward Radio is an audio production of the Speculist. You'll find us online at speculist.com. That's SPECULIST.com, or go straight to the blog at blog.speculist.com. At the Speculist and on Fast Forward Radio, we are all about a convergence of emerging technologies and emerging possibilities which lie at the heart of this, the greatest period of transformation in human history. Our world is changing in ways that are difficult to predict, sometimes even difficult to imagine. And Fast Forward Radio is your guide to an astounding future that lies ahead and that will be here sooner than you think. My name is Phil Bowermaster, and with me in the virtual studio is my co-blogger, co-futurist, and co-host, Stephen Gordon. Hello, Stephen.
Hey, Phil. How are you?
Well, I'm super fantastic. How are you, my friend?
I'm also great. Doing just fine.
Are you keeping warm and dry down there, battening down the hatches and so forth?
So far, so good. I live up in the north corner of Louisiana, and so when we get hit with hurricanes, it's usually just a pretty bad storm is what it amounts to.
Right.
It's generally not any more dangerous than just a real bad thunderstorm that seems to drag on all day.
Right.
Typically a thunderstorm's in and out, right? Well, these things just sit on top of you for a while, and so that's what we're expecting to arrive sometime in the middle of the night, to begin arriving with the outer pans, and then dump as much as 5 inches on us tomorrow. With the high winds and everything, fully expect to have some power outages around here, but that's about as bad as it gets. More concerned about folks a little further south than us, Baton Rouge, New Orleans, and down that way.
What's the prognosis? What's the expectation that's going to happen this time out? Anybody saying?
Well, it's we don't. No one thinks really that it's going to swamp the levees, overcome the levees like it did with Katrina. Katrina, when it came ashore, it was briefly a Category 5. I mean, that's just about as bad as it can get. That monster was as big as the Gulf, the Gulf of Mexico, just about when it came ashore, and it was a direct hit on New Orleans. It was interesting because years prior to Katrina hitting, the experts were saying, if we ever had a really big one hit directly New Orleans, we could lose the city.
Right.
And that was always out there. Yeah. And it happened. We basically lost New Orleans. It, obviously we tend to rebuild things, but so it has come back, and I think the population of New Orleans is finally back up where it was prior to Katrina, but it took a long time. It was basically a decade coming back.
Well, and huge destructive storm, huge rebuilding effort. But again, we're saying nothing like that.
No, it doesn't look like. Long story short, it doesn't look like that this time. We got Category 1 is all it is, and really by now it's actually gone down to a tropical storm. So it's just a pretty bad storm. I understand it did swamp some levees in some of the low-lying parishes. Blackman Parish, they got some serious water. I think it was mandatory evacuation there, so I don't expect a large loss of life or injuries down there. So,
all right. Well,
it's a real bad storm.
Yeah. Keep dry, and keep us posted on that. We've got we're concerned about you and all our friends in Louisiana. All right. Well, we've got a huge show tonight. Before we bring out our guest, though, we had a rather important historical figure, the loss of a rather important historical figure over the weekend. Stephen, I think you've got some audio to share with us.
It's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind.
Now we can skip over this time how that is perhaps the greatest blown line in all of history, and just focus on the fact.
Poor guy break. If he blew the line, I'm not convinced he did. I think it might have been a static pop that we lost the in, but it's okay. We know what he meant, and it's a great line.
Well, it's interesting when obviously we're talking about Neil Armstrong, astronaut, first man to set foot on the moon, died at age 82 on Saturday. It's interesting when you play that clip. You sampled just the money line there, but I was very interested listening to him talking right before and right after that, how different his tone and everything about how he delivered that was. You know, he was he's observing that there's some dust that looks kind of like charcoal dust, and now I'm going to do this, and now I'm going to step off, and then he says, you know, you can tell this is like, this is important, got to say this, and then it's like he's just back, you know, a man doing his job once again.
I've heard him described about people who knew him. Who said that, you know, he's not going to be able to say anything special. He's just the most prosaic person you'll ever meet. You know, I mean, he's a no-nonsense kind of guy, and how in the world is he going to say something that's appropriate and, you know, poetic? That's just not to do. Well, and you know, and nobody fed him this line either. It was his line. And so he was able. He delivered it, and but like you say, you know, at one point, the dust is really fine. You know, it's real fine-grained dust, and then he says his line, and then he's, yeah, I'm kicking it up with my boot. Yeah, this is very fine dust. You know, you know, it's understandable why he would be fascinated by that, Phil, because there was some concern that, you know, we didn't know exactly what the moon was. We'd had some probes and things on the moon, but, you know, there's some concern that what if it's 10 feet of dust and you just sit down and you sink down in it and, you know, you can't get out.
Oh, sure. No, I mean, actually, that's what I really like about it is here you've got a man focused on his job, doing his task, stops for a minute, puts on his historical momentum, you know, momentously important historical occasion hat for a sec, and then back off, much more comfortable. He's an engineer. He's, you know, he's this man on a mission, and he's going to carry on with his mission. I think there's not enough wonderful things you can say about Neil Armstrong and really all of those Apollo, Gemini, and Mercury astronauts, guys who opened up a new frontier for us. But a quote that I found from J.G. Ballard, I put this up on Facebook earlier today, I think really kind of sums it up. J.G. Ballard wrote, Neil Armstrong may well be the only human being of our time to be remembered 50,000 years from now. And, you know, you let that one sink in and you go, that's entirely possible. And what's interesting about that, when we think about it, I noticed somebody on another site said, well, what about maybe Jesus? And I said, okay, Jesus is not from our time, for one thing. Okay,
that's a couple thousand years ago.
Yeah, you know, so please read the quote carefully. But the thing that struck me about this is I got to thinking about this is we don't know of any individual human being who lived 50,000 years ago today, or do we?
Right.
Can you name an individual human being who lived 50,000 years ago?
No, that's prehistoric. I mean, probably the earliest names are, you know, maybe some of the kings. Well, you know, it
occurred to me that there is one that we know of, and that's the mitochondrial Eve, lived about 57,000 years ago, right? Right, we don't know who she is.
We've named her Eve.
Yeah, that wasn't really her name. You know, we gave her that name, and in fact, depending on how things pan out, that may be how Neil Armstrong is remembered too. They'll say, well, there was some person who was the first person ever to set foot on the moon back when we were only on Earth. And whoever that person was really set things, you know, it's possible that...
it was about this time when it happened, and yeah, I can see that.
Yeah, the astronomical Adam or something like that he'll be remembered as without even his name being remembered. Although I think that whole analysis from J.G. Ballard is a little unfair to Buzz Aldrin, I must say. And, of course, Michael Collins always gets left out. But anyway, just, you know, nothing but... great appreciation to all of the astronauts, and we honor the memory of Neil Armstrong. Absolutely. All right. Well, let's go ahead and get started with our topic of the evening. We're going to be talking about what is reality made of. We're going to explore one of our favorite topics with one of our favorite guests. We're pleased to welcome Jim Elvidge back to the program. He's a Cornell-educated entrepreneur and inventor. He holds 4 patents in digital signal processing. His love of music inspired him to develop one of the world's first PC-based digital music samplers and to co-found RadioAMP, which was the first private label online streaming radio company. In recent years, he's turned his attention to the ultimate question of existence and, drawing on a broad and eclectic base of knowledge and interest, has come up with a unique explanation for, well, pretty much everything. Jim, welcome back to Fast Forward Radio.
Thank you very much, Phil. It's really great to be on. I've always enjoyed the show. And greetings, Stephen.
Thank you, Joe.
We're thrilled to have you. we're looking forward to getting into talking about some new insights that you mentioned around the nature of consciousness and the nature of matter. But before we dive into that, I thought it might be good for listeners who haven't been down this road with us before to just start with some of the basics and give us, if you could, give us the summarized version of why you think it's wise at least to entertain the possibility that we might be living in a computer simulation.
Yeah, and thanks, Phil, and I appreciate the way you put that too, because I do always try to make it clear that I'm not convinced of this. I'm not necessarily a believer of anything. I like to look at evidence and kind of see where it takes us, and that's pretty much the way science works, and it's the way industry works, and it's a proven method. But interestingly enough, we have a lot of preconceived notions about what our reality is all about. And those preconceived notions are based on what? They're based on, some history, some things that we've heard, we've read, some things that may be very mythological. So if you actually look at all the categories of evidence that are out there, you come to the conclusion that the possibility that our world, our reality, is under some program control is a very real possibility. And there's some very interesting evidence that has come forth recently that supports that as well. So the longer this goes on, since I wrote the book in 2008, I put up on the website 4 kind of specific categories of evidence. But since then, I think there have been 4 or 5 more specific categories. So really there's quite a bit of evidence, and it's a hard thing to kind of wrap your head around and believe in, but if you just go by the evidence, it's definitely something to consider.
So just for the sake of those who haven't heard this before, give us 1 or 2 examples of the kinds of categories of evidence, or specific examples of evidence, if you could.
Yeah, sure. One of the first ones comes from the field of philosophy or logic, and that I have to give credit to Nick Bostrom, a philosopher from Oxford University, for this one. Back in, I think, 1999, he submitted a paper called The Simulation Argument, and basically it goes like this, that at some point in our future, we will be able to create reality simulations that we can enjoy, by either putting devices, headphones and goggles on, or, a neural implant or something like that intercepts our, our conscious processing of signals. And we'll be able to enjoy those things, and they'll be indistinguishable from reality. I mean, today you can go to your electronic superstore and watch some video games that you almost can't tell. Football games, Madden 2013 or whatever the latest one is. You really can barely tell that it's a game and
that you're not looking at a football game. Yeah.
Exactly. So, given the fact that we will do that, and we're heading in that direction, and that we will, once we're able to create those simulations and those sort of fantasy scenarios, we'll do millions of them. There's no reason why we wouldn't. When we hit upon something that people enjoy, we mass produce it. And so the argument goes that one of 3 things will happen. Either we haven't gotten to that point. We won't get to that point because we will destroy ourselves before we do, and there are a lot of people that think that we're heading for a civilization-ending event, technology-based or otherwise, or we make a conscious decision not to pursue that kind of technology, and I think we can probably throw that out, given that we pretty much pursue anything that's in front of us. Or the third one is we will get there, and if we get there and we create these millions of simulations, the odds that we're in the one 20 years before that point is much less than the odds that we're actually in one of those millions. So, from a logic standpoint, one could make the argument that we're probably living in a simulation. Then you look at the second one that I might mention is from the field of physics. A lot of quantum physicists, not all, but a lot of them believe that space and time are quantized, so that when you get down to a very granular level, Planck length, 10 to the minus 36 meters kind of thing, that you can't talk about a continuity between points. Instead, space is either here or there, some unit away, and things move between those units in discrete chunks. Similarly, time may chunk along in that kind of pattern. They call the smallest unit of time that you could possibly perceive is called a jiffy, and that's based on quantum theory. So if time moves along...
That's a great technical term, isn't it?
It is, isn't it?
I love that.
Yeah. So, it could be a, femto, pico something, but instead it's a jiffy.
Yeah.
So same kind of thing, if that's also chunking along that way, then time is also discrete. A lot of physicists have written books on this, Julian Barber, many others. So, but if you think about it, that's really the way a computer works anyway. There's nothing that happens between two clock cycles of a CPU. It's basically put its data into memory or fetched its data from a disk or wherever it's getting it from, and it's just waiting for the next time that the chip gets triggered by a clock cycle. So it's chunking along.
Or the resolution of the monitor finally comes down to pixels, and
exactly.
They're discrete pieces. You don't go any smaller than that because you're done.
Same kind of thing. And when you write a program to a certain resolution. You model objects. If you want to write one of these simulation programs or a video game or something like that, you're going to model your object to 16 bits or 32 or 64 or something convenient that's a good trade-off between, performance and cost. So, the fact that physicists say our reality acts that way really resembles a computational mechanism, and it's hard to think of another reason why we wouldn't be in a continuous world. Why would our world be discrete? And the only reason I can think of is that it is that cost-benefit trade-off. It would be infinitely expensive. It would take infinite resources to create a continuous world, but it takes a finite set of resources, which we all deal with, to create a discrete one.
Right. So that argument, to me, it always shows that the world, that the universe is consistent with being programmed, although it could also just be that it just is here, and it just happens to work in that discrete way, right? I mean,
yes, exactly.
Yeah, wouldn't necessarily have to be a program reality, but it's interesting when you look at when you start adding them up, as you mentioned, and it's great. It's great in your book when you start working your way down the chain, and you say, well, there's this, and then there's this, and then this is consistent with it, and you start to go, well, gosh, maybe there's something to all this.
Yeah, it's a good point. If you take
one thing I was, thinking about with the Madden football example is that, when you're playing the game, you never, forget that you're playing a game, right? The one constraint, let's say, imagine a time 30, 40 years from now when, our games are completely realistic. The last constraint to really total immersion, into a game would be memory of the larger reality around you. What if you could just banish that memory and totally absorb yourself in the game, whatever that game is, for a short period of time? That might be part of what we're thinking about here or looking at.
Absolutely, and that's a really good point too. And that idea of erasing memories is an avenue of inquiry that's underway today. I mean, there are chemical means of erasing memories. It's kind of like sculpting with a sledgehammer, but
right.
There are also, you could imagine sort of, if you believe in the idea that your memories are captured within your brain, you could imagine, say, a nano device that goes in and seeks out certain synapses and zaps them. Or you could imagine a scenario where your brain gets scanned in some way, and this sounds far-fetched today, but it is certainly not far-fetched if you think about how far we've come in the last 20 or 30 years. You could imagine your brain gets scanned in some way, and that scan records your memories, uploads them, wipes them out, inserts the construct of the simulation that you're going to experience. You experience it. When you're done, the device under control replaces your memories, and now you have a nice memory of that experience plus what you had before.
That sounds pretty good, actually.
It does.
I might sign up for that. Have you seen? I'm sure you have seen Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
I did. Yep.
Yeah. So there's a movie that deals with this idea, kind of on medical level, where people are undergoing some procedure to have memories of other people removed from their lives. They can forget about relationships. It seems to be the primary use that it's put to. And there's a scene where Jim Carrey's learning about it, and he's talking to the doctor, and he says, well, I don't know. I'm just worried that this procedure might cause brain damage. And the doctor says, well, technically the procedure is brain damage, right?
Right.
Exactly. We're talking about excising stuff out of people's brains at this point. It would be a risky proposition, I think.
Yes, you mentioned one thing before too, Phil, that if you take one of these arguments by itself, you might say, well, I give that, say, a 10% probability or 30% probability that, that a programmed reality might be the reason behind that. But if you take all of them together and you multiply up those probabilities, then you start finding that you're, really leaning toward, a highly probable solution to all of these things.
Exactly. I mean, go ahead, Stephen. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry, Phil. I heard something that was, I think it was probably a year ago, maybe 6 months to a year ago. A physicist was talking about error correction code, and some of the stuff he was seeing, basically the universe's structure. It was far beyond me. I'll just go out on a limb and just say I didn't understand what the heck he was talking about. But are you familiar with that?
Yeah, I am. The physicist you're mentioning is James Gates, and what he discovered, and honestly, it's beyond me too, but what he discovered was an error correction code in physics equations. So I don't fully understand how that implies that that our reality might be a simulation, because, well, first of all, just a quick thing about error correction codes. Those are codes that are put in place so that if your data gets lost or destroyed, it can be recreated. CDs, DVDs have these things so that, if you get a scratch on the DVD or something like that, there's sort of redundancy built into these codes that'll allow you to recreate the data. But the string theory equations or supersymmetry equations are man-made equations. So to say that we found, something that looks like a man-made code in man-made equations doesn't sound so unusual to me. We haven't determined that string theory is an accurate representation, or supersymmetry is an accurate representation of reality. So, again,
I guess it's the issue of whether the universe is spitting out that equation. If the universe is spitting out an equation with error correction code in it, then that's pretty compelling.
Exactly. Now I don't know if you guys read Contact by Carl Sagan. It was different than the movie. In the end, he had a scene where people had printed out pi in such a way that it created a circle. And there was sort of unmistakable evidence that there was, something unique behind nature. But this one about the error correction blocks, I haven't really understood, whether that's really evidence for a simulation.
Actually, Jab in the chat room had brought this up when we first started talking about this. Before Stephen, before you mentioned James Gates, and he said that something interesting about this is that James Gates apparently doesn't feel entirely comfortable talking about this. That he feels he's discovered this thing, and he'd perhaps rather he didn't. Also says that there's only 4 people in the world that can understand his findings, and I'm thinking none of those people are on the show tonight, apparently.
Well, I don't feel so bad then.
Yeah.
and that's actually kind of a sad reflection on the scientific community, because I've gone through some of the blogs and some of the forums and things like that where they people will be disparaging about anything that is new, and of course some media outlets may take some of these findings out of context and make it seem like it's evidence that we're in the Matrix or something like that.
Right.
And so his name gets associated with that, and that may make things difficult for him in his research. So it is kind of unfortunate that all happens.
And while we're in the chat room, interesting critique of the argument you just made from Ken. He says, and this is talking about how everything adds up. He says, haven't you begun with the question, is this a program reality? Therefore, you have a 50% chance of the answer being yes. Now, is that the trick we're playing, or is there more at work here than that?
No, I mean, I didn't start with that. I didn't start looking for evidence when I wrote the book. I actually started writing a book on relativity, and I, had a kind of a brainstorm that there could be something beyond relativity. And the more research I did, the more I came across these other categories of evidence that all together added up to something which I thought was kind of a significant demonstration of sort of a programmed nature of our world. So no, I didn't start with that premise. Instead, it came to me after a while.
Yeah, and it seems that that no one would just jump to that being a 50-50 chance anyway, right?
Right.
Am I going to win $1 million tomorrow or not? Hey, I guess I got a 50-50 shot, right?
Well, here's an interesting one. If you're familiar with the research facility in Vienna called IQOQI, IQOQI, they do some really groundbreaking research into the nature of reality at a quantum level. So they're looking at things like, is there really an observer effect? Does reality really exist when you're not observing it? And they have come to a conclusion that reality as an attribute doesn't exist to a certainty of 80 orders of magnitude. So, I mean, this is an incredible, error bar that they've come up with based on the results of their experiments. And yet, despite an error bar of 1 in 1 followed by 80 zeros, kind of a ridiculously huge number, despite that, when you ask those physicists if they really believe this, they say, not so sure. So that just shows how hard it is to get beyond the preconceived notions that we have about things.
So their conclusion is that it's extremely unlikely that reality is a persistent thing. That I didn't quite follow what they had concluded there, or what the numbers were showing them there.
Right. So in quantum mechanics, there's this a strange effect called an observer effect, where in some experiments, it depends on what the observer is doing and looking for. The results of the experiments will differ. So basically, this comes from the double slit experiment and a lot of kind of variations on that over the years. So, this has been a debate from Einstein to Bell in the 60s and Elaine Aspect, and there's a very rich history of this debate. And it's first in an institute in Israel, I forget the name, Weizmann Institute perhaps, in 1998, they came up with a very conclusive bit of evidence that reality doesn't exist unless it's observed. And then IQOQI just took it to this 80 orders of magnitude in 2008. So, over time, it's become apparent that, a particle doesn't really do what you think it does until you actually observe it doing that thing.
Right, okay.
So then you say, well, what about a macroscopic situation? Well, a macroscopic situation is made up of a whole bunch of particles. So, ultimately, the argument there might be that reality really does depend a lot on the observer.
That's consistent with computer games, isn't it?
Absolutely, perfectly consistent. And that's another one of those arguments. And talk about kind of working backwards at things. At one point, I said, well, what if I were to create a reality simulation that was really, really good, but I did it using kind of known technology? I certainly wouldn't need to model everything. I don't need to model that pen that's sitting on your desk down to the atomic level, because nobody's looking at that. Nobody's investigating that pen at the atomic level. So it could take up 3 kilobytes or something like that, because that's all that's needed to render that pen in the reality. But as soon as somebody breaks it open and sticks it under an electron microscope, now you need to have some model that identifies, well, where are the atoms that is made of, because we have to put them somewhere. So that can be an algorithmic thing, but it means that there's a whole lot of compression, if you will, between the amount of data that you need to describe something and the amount of data that you need to experience something. So I would design a reality simulation or universe just in such a way that reflects what we see in quantum mechanics, which is until we actually observe something, we don't know where it is. What causes the entanglement effect? That's an interesting one as well. Two particles, when they get very close together, suddenly become sort of in lockstep. So you can take them light years apart, and whatever one particle does, the other one does, something in lockstep with the other one, almost as if they're communicating faster than the speed of light. And this has bothered physicists for a century now. So, but if you think about it, and you think, well, when we design an experiment where we can actually observe properties of that particle, then if I were doing this with a programmed reality model, how might I define those properties? Well, I'd probably go look them up in some sort of table and seed that table with a random number generator, and you know what? I might as well do that to both particles with the same seed at the same time because they're both together, and so therefore, after that, they're always going to follow that. It's almost like, if you ever played around with random number generators, once you have the same seed, they all follow the same progression after that. They all generate the same thing given the same input.
Right. So once again, a couple of good examples of things that could just be the weird way the universe works, but also it's the weird way the universe works that happens to be completely consistent with the universe being some kind of a computer program. Just odd how many of those show up. Well, let's talk a little bit about the two topics that I mentioned earlier that we had discussed in our email chat, and those are one that we think of as being very mysterious and arcane and closely related to this subject, consciousness, and one that we don't think of as being all that mysterious or hard to deal with at all, which is matter. And you said that there are some new understandings on both of those. Why don't we start with what I think is going to be the easier one of those two, which is matter, and tell us about how the nature of matter is being understood differently now than it has been in the past.
Oh, sure, yeah, and that's really an interesting topic because you think about what is matter, and you feel like if I touch something, I'm feeling matter, but what you're really feeling is you're feeling a repulsive force from the electron shell of the atoms of the thing that you're touching against the electron shell of the atoms in your fingertips. You don't actually touch matter. You don't actually, your atoms don't come in contact with the atoms of the thing that you feel is hard or you feel is there. You're just feeling the result of a force, and your brain is processing those signals that are coming through your fingertips or whatever. So, when you start thinking about it, it's kind of hard to define what matter really is. It used to be thought that matter was these little, solid billiard balls. This is sort of the Greek view of things. It's where the word atom came from.
Right.
Even in the 1800s, that was still the view of matter, that it was, comprised of these little tiny things, and they were maybe squished together. So when I touch something hard, it's because all of these little tiny atoms are all squished together, and I'm actually feeling them. Well, what Ernest Rutherford and others found out is that those little tiny billiard balls aren't really, they're very tenuous, actually. They consist of other little tiny billiard balls in the middle of them with, little tiny billiard balls called electrons that whip around those, the nucleus at very high speeds. And the amount of space, the percentage of space that's in an atom, once this discovery was made, was actually 99.13 in a row percent space. So now you're down to 99.99913 that percentage of normal matter is empty space. Well, later on we found out that those little tiny billiard balls, those protons and electrons and things, they actually weren't billiard balls either. The protons and the neutrons could be broken into quarks, and nobody really quite knows how much space is in between those. And string theorists go even further, and they say that Actually, all particles are is a vibrating bit of string, and the string could be as narrow as a Planck length, so that's 1 to the times 10 to the minus 36 meters or whatever, but it's just vibrating, and it's vibrating at different frequencies for different particles. Well, if that's true, now each of those particles is almost empty space, and normal matter is all but 1, times 10 to the minus 52nd empty space. So it's almost like there's nothing there at all. And when you kind of go down that path of thinking, you ask yourself the question, why does a string even have to be, a Planck length wide? Why does that have to be a solid thing at all? Like, why can't the definition of, if the definition of a neutron is a string vibrating at some particular frequency, why can't the definition of a neutron just be the number that corresponds to that frequency? It could be, and therefore that number is just data. So, I'm kind of the feeling that our world is made of data, which again, is where we're heading if you go down this path of analysis of matter, and it's again supportive of the idea that it's programmatic.
Now, the immediate response I have to that is, okay, well, sure, it's data, but it must be data playing out on something, right? Because there's data which is just completely ephemeral, and then there's like, my car, right? Which maybe it is just a lot of data, but I can get in it and drive it around, right? And I'm here too.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? I feel like there's actually something going on there. So are you saying that matter is just data, or that it's data running on something, or?
So I'm not saying that I know that at all, but it could. There's no reason why it couldn't be, is what I'm saying. We don't interact with any really solid stuff. I mean, even standard physics says that mass emerges from something going through a Higgs field. So it's a very mysterious process where matter gets created at all, and nobody knows what that is. So the idea that matter is just data, there's nothing wrong with that idea. And so you might ask the question, well, how does stuff come about? And I would, suggest that one of the interesting ideas here is the ideas of cellular autonoma, like the game of life. You can start with some very simple rules in the game of life and create these kind of complex objects that move around the screen, and they interact with each other. So maybe at a very, very fundamental level, things are data, and there are rules that determine how that data interacts with each other, with its neighboring bits, and those rules beget, objects, and those objects beget other objects, and those objects, interact and beget other objects, and ultimately you get complexity from a simple set of rules and data. And that data then maybe it's our consciousness, and maybe this leads us to the other one. It's our consciousness that's turning that into interpreting that as matter, right? It's that focused observer that's giving you the idea that those particular numbers have that particular meaning, right? Or that they're instantiating this physical universe we see around us. Okay, so yeah, and that goes back to the question that you asked before about the eclectic and the nature of objective reality. So objective reality is what's really out there. What's there independent of our observation. Subjective reality, which is all we really know, is not that. Our subjective reality is light, electromagnetic waves bouncing off of things and entering our eyes and triggering, electrochemical reactions in our retinas that go to our brain, and our brain processes it, and our brain, may be subject to some filtering mechanisms based on our fears and our history and our environment and all that kind of stuff. But that's what we are. That's what we experience. We don't experience real stuff. We experience what our consciousness tells us we experience.
Well, I made the title of tonight's show a question. what is reality made of? And I actually had a proposed answer to the question. And to me, the only answer we'll ever really know is subjective experience. That's as close to reality as we'll ever get, is whatever we're subjectively experiencing of it. Although we can perhaps come to understand what the underpinnings of that might be and what they imply. Finally, all we're ever having is a series of subjective experiences until they stop. But I want to come back to that in a moment, because I want to hear what you have to say about the nature of consciousness. This is one of the most hotly debated, I think, of all topics, especially in understanding computer technology and talking about accelerating change, talking about artificial intelligence. This is one of the hot buttons, consciousness. What is it?
Yeah.
Is it something that's most people nowadays think it's pretty much something resident in the brain? There's but then there's the question of, is it resident in the neurons, or is it resident, as Penrose says, in this overall quantum process that's going on? So what's the new understanding of consciousness that might turn things around for us here?
Well, sure. It certainly would depend on who you talk to. So
You're right.
In people who research the brain, neuroscientists, they are going to give you one answer, and others will give you a different answer. But I would say that I don't think anybody has proven in any means that consciousness emerges from the complexity of the brain, or that consciousness resides in the brain. I've read many articles about some kind of ephemeral evidence that seems to imply that there's a system construct that goes on, where learning goes on, where recognition goes on, and the kinds of things, the kind of awareness, capabilities that we have could be explained by the structure of a brain, but there's nothing definitive.
Before you go on, Jim, exactly. No one has proved that, but it is assumed because where else, right? I mean,
But it's assumed because we live in a very scientific biased world that has essentially said there is no designer, there is no God, there is no other realm out there. It is just physical matter reality. If that is your worldview, then yes, you're going to have to believe that consciousness emerges from the brain, because you have no other way of explaining that.
Right.
But unfortunately, there's no evidence to support that. There is some evidence to support the other side of it, which is what I think is very interesting. So I guess I'll head into some of that.
Let's hear some. Yeah, absolutely.
Sure.
This is good.
Well, one thing is to kind of look at the idea of that consciousness could emerge from complexity of the brain. If that were true, then we would have to say that human brains are complex enough for consciousness to emerge. And you might ask the question, well, what about cats or dogs or fish or something like that? And there was a recent declaration by many scientists that all mammals, no matter how small they were, are conscious and have awareness just like humans. So science is coming to that conclusion. So that puts it down to the idea that even something as small as a mouse, that has a brain that's maybe a millionth the complexity of ours, and I just pulled that number out of the air. I don't know what it really is, but obviously much, much smaller, that even that is complex enough for consciousness to emerge. And yet, the Internet has more links than we have neurons in our brain, and I don't think anybody thinks that the Internet is conscious yet. The Sequoia project, computer project, has a computer performance of 16 petaflops. The brain, the high end of the estimates of the capacity of the brain, is less than that. So, we're building devices that are as complex as the brain. We're interconnecting devices at a complexity level of the brain, and yet we're not really seeing consciousness emerge anywhere. It doesn't appear to be. So there's just kind of an argument against. But one of the other things is there was a book written by a cardiologist named Pim van Lommel about consciousness beyond death. And he makes some pretty interesting arguments in that book, each of which he references from other data, such as the idea that every day you have 50 billion cells that are regenerated. And the quarks and the gluons in our bodies are destroyed and regenerated 10 to the 23rd times per second. So if we're constantly regenerating all the matter, all the physical stuff that makes up our body, how can our consciousness be continuous? How can it continue through all this regeneration of cells and molecular, decomposition and renewal? It's an interesting argument. I mean, where is it that actually stores the memories and stores the things that we need to have a continuous consciousness if they're constantly being destroyed? In addition, he's got a great deal of evidence that consciousness persists after death in the form of near-death experiences that occur when blood has been drained from people's brains or people have completely flatlined, no electrical activity whatsoever, and they have an extremely lucid consciousness, not the kind of consciousness that typically happens when when your brain is disintegrating, but something very lucid, and it's very different. And, that's evidence by itself that, if that can happen when there's no electrical activity in the brain, then either we don't know what really causes consciousness in the brain or consciousness is somewhere else.
All right, so let's look at that. Stephen, I'm starting to think we should have scheduled a 90-minute show tonight, huh? This is great stuff. Now, if just for a moment, we'll say consciousness is not resident in the brain, that it's not the structure of the brain, the neurons that are creating consciousness. Would it still be argued that there must be some relationship between the brain and consciousness? That somehow the two things are connected. That the brain is doing something.
Right.
And if not there, I go back to the earlier question, because this is the one that I hear all my thoroughly grounded materialist friends saying. Where then, right? Where's consciousness taking place if not in the brain?
So the best way to answer that is to say that it is, and again, I'm just speaking based on some evidence here and not necessarily believing one or the other, but I would say the best place that you could say this is from some other, reality or some other level of reality other than the physical one that we live in, and that's where it is, and it's interacting with our brain in such a way where it's loading in memories when we need it, it's accepting our conscious experiences, and maybe to some extent the free will is out there somewhere, but the stuff that we need for our day-to-day activities is in our head, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, I like it. It makes sense to me. I think that that everything you're saying makes a lot of sense, but it's probably the last one that that a certain sector of the scientific community is going to budge on, right? You know what I'm saying? It's like when you talk about this might be a computer simulation, I can see people kind of nodding and saying, yeah, that could be. But as soon as you start saying essentially language that goes in line with we have a soul, right? Mm-hmm. You're not saying that, but I mean it lines up with that. That's when all the bells and alarms start sounding and the lights start flashing and people start saying, no, you can't you can't introduce those kinds of ideas.
But the question to ask them is why? Why can't you? What is wrong with that? And I don't know if you've ever read Thomas Campbell's book, My Big Toe. I'm actually getting through it right now, but he makes some interesting analogs in there. So, for example, the bacteria that lives in your gut, it doesn't know from sunlight, it doesn't know what the sun is, it doesn't know really where food comes from or anything like that. All it knows is its own little reality. So, we're probably the same way. We're limited by the capacity of our brain, in terms of what we can experience and what we can comprehend. I think people are really afraid of the idea that there's something else out there, but if you kind of put aside your fear and say, going by the evidence, maybe there is, that's okay. We don't understand it. We can't figure it out. We can't even figure out how to, create scientific experiments that validate it. We're getting there, actually, but I'm going to be open-minded to it. And, I see nothing wrong with doing that, and I think that's the proper frame of mind to be in, not, there can't be anything other than physical matter reality. That's just closed-minded. And, in fact, there's tremendous evidence compiled by Dean Radin and many others that things happen, in a paranormal way that science can't explain at all.
And the bottom line is, if there is something more, and you don't accept the possibility that there might be, and you're investigating, you're never going to get to the truth, right? The thing that you're supposedly hoping to accomplish via science.
Yeah, because you've created a wall, and you don't want to allow your experiment to go outside of that wall, so you're never going to find out anything.
Absolutely. Okay. Well, we're coming close on our time, and I could talk about this subject of consciousness all night, but I want to get to one more thing. We're gonna revisit something we talked about on the World Transformed last year when you were a part of the panel, and I gave the example of the Emperor Norton in San Francisco. I talked about how he was in a way living in kind of a simulated reality because he was this individual who apparently was suffering from some delusions, but he thought he was the Emperor of the United States. And he gathered kind of a large pop following there in San Francisco. It was the 19th century, and he had local shops making clothes for him, and the cops would defer to him, and people were giving him allowances, and he was very much in his own mind, and in certain ways in reality, living the life of an emperor. Which had nothing to do with what his reality really was. It reminds me of the choice that Neo is offered in the Matrix: the red pill versus the blue pill. Right? Mm-hmm. If you take the blue pill, you stay in the Matrix, and you never have any understanding of how the world actually operates. If you take the red pill, then you find out how all this works. But you actually go from living in a fairly pleasant world, in the case of that movie, to this really kind of dismal, scary, kind of horrifying world that the people lived in there. Well, to me, Emperor Norton is a great example of that, right? He was just fine with his delusion that he was the emperor, right? If you offered him the red pill, he probably wouldn't want it, because then he would just be a mental health patient, right? Rather than getting to be an emperor, which is a better deal. So my question is, Jim, red pill or blue pill? I think you must be pretty heavily in the red pill camp. Am I right?
Yeah, I tend to be in the red pill camp, and I kind of believe what Einstein said, that truth is unattainable, but it's the journey that is rewarding. And I just like to learn, and I like to learn about my reality and about I try to keep an open mind and try to look at the evidence and see where it takes me. But that's exciting to me, and then it's just something that kind of drives me. So I can't even imagine wanting to. Well, I guess I can imagine wanting to stay in a pleasant world as well. But if there's even a way that you can get kind of a glimpse of the other reality with a little bit of the red pill and pop back into the blue once in a while, maybe that's the best of both worlds. Because you know what, we all have a what's the term, a sphere, a comfort zone, right? And some people's comfort zone is very small, and some people's comfort zone is bigger, but the fact is we all have one, and once we get outside of that, we panic, and we get scared, and it feels uncomfortable, and it's nauseating and everything else. So I don't know if I could handle the red pill.
Yeah, how about you, Stephen?
It reminds me of an old quote by H.P. Lovecraft. Y'all probably know exactly the one I'm talking about. He was a sci-fi guy from early in the 20th century. He said, the sciences, each straining in its own direction, have hitherto harmed us little, but someday the piecing together of disassociated knowledge will open up such terrifying and of our frightful position therein that we shall either go mad from the revelation or flee from the deadly light into the peace and safety of a new dark age. I don't buy that. I think that truth is a reward, and I go along with Jim. I think we may not ever get ultimate truth, but the journey so far has been nothing but good, and every advance we've made creates new problems, but they're less than the problems that they solve. So I say let's keep pressing forward.
Absolutely. Well, interesting discussion breaking out in the chat room about a soul, and we'll have to pick this up again. This is really kind of carrying on the discussion we had a couple of weeks ago with Julio Prisco about touring church. So we've had a couple of really fascinating shows talking about these kinds of issues. I got to say, I'm very much in the red pill camp. There's no way I would not want to know what the ultimate reality is, and especially if I put myself into this simulation, right? If this is a simulation that I put myself into, I would want to know why exactly this. I mean, parts of it, which I really dig, I would say, okay, well, I can immediately see why I did this. But what about all, there's certain things I would be very interested to know how it was that I happened to do that. That's assuming that that there's some version of ourselves who had some role to play in making that happen. Well, Jim, the time has just flashed past. We're going to have you back again soon because we love talking to you, and it's great getting into this stuff. And I feel, as always, we've just kind of scratched the surface.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I love the way you guys, direct the conversation and go down some, really interesting paths, and I've always enjoyed all the shows that I've done on Fast Forward. So I would be, very much pleased to come back on the show.
All right, well, let's plan on doing that for sure. Thanks for being with us. Stephen, before we jump to our music, something that I forgot to mention earlier that I had promised Sean Key that I would mention is that Liftport has started their Kickstarter campaign. So if you're interested in helping to fund the first real space elevator project, go to Kickstarter, do a search for Liftport. You can find information on that program there and start making the space elevator future happen. I've got a little link on that I'll put in the chat room, and then Stephen, you can tell us about our music.
Absolutely. Before I do, I just want to say we got some news this week about wood pulp being used to create something as strong as carbon nanotubes. So maybe that if we can use sawdust to create our space elevator, that might be the way to get there.
Now you're talking. All right.
Yeah, absolutely. Our music tonight is Unfreeze by Hollywood Drunks.
Unfreeze by Hollywood Drunks. All right, sounds like my kind of music. Thanks for putting that together, Stephen. Thanks, everyone, for being part of the program this evening. Great chat going on in the chat room. For those of you listening live and for those of you listening via MP3, thanks for being part of Fast Forward Radio. We'll be back again next week at the regular time, and until then, live to see it.
Blog Talk Radio, where millions of hosts and listeners gather.